I'm Lee Moore.
And I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
All right, Lee.
What do we have today?
We have something super exciting. Do you want to tell the listeners what's super exciting today?
I don't even know if I can contain myself enough to talk about it.
If you need to limber up a little bit before you announce it, I'll just go ahead and announce it because you're overwrought with excitement. We're going to talk about an exam.
An exam? Like a test?
Like a test, Lee. Very good.
Oh, my goodness. I love tests.
I do, too. And I'm sure every listener out there just got this thrill of excitement when I said exam.
But this is a pretty important exam. Yeah. Let me ask you something. I don't normally think of exams as literature. How are you justifying this as a kind of literature?
I don't know. I have a fairly broad definition of literature, but the reason we brought it up to talk about is less for its literariness.
But we should say it is on a test on literature.
It is a test on literature. It is an actual exam question by the emperor in the year 1070 to that year's list of palace examination students.
Can you explain a little bit more about the exam system in China and how it worked back then?
Well, back then, first of all, it's so old, the exam system. I don't have the dates in front of me of when the first exam was, but when you think that it was it had an entrenched tradition by the 11th century, that's older than most quote-unquote civilized cultures in Europe and the United States. By a long shot, their exam system is that old.
Well, I guess, so a couple of things. We should remember that, so the exam system, one thing when people talk about it, I think a lot of people don't get that it's actually this evolving thing.
Yeah.
They had some form of it in the Tang Dynasty, but in the Tang Dynasty, it was more related to writing good poetry.
Yeah, it was more of an aesthetic test. So, for example, you'd go into the exam hall for the top tier. There were 3 tiers of examinations. The first tier was sort of what we would think of as like a city test. Then there was what you would think of as a state test. And then there's what we'd think of as the national test, the palace exam, where you actually sat before the emperor on your mat with your scroll and wrote. So, yeah, but what they were tested on during the Tang Dynasty was a lot of poetry, a lot of recitation, of being able to memorize something and respond to it in verse and in a similar kind of verse, demonstrating your mastery of sort of the music and the rhyme.
And we should mention in the Li Xiangying the podcast, we've talked about how awesome Tang Dynasty poetry was. Dufu podcast, we also, I believe, talked about it, if that's up now. Tang Dynasty poetry is this kind of like apex of poetry. Song Dynasty, the dynasty that we're looking at today with the exam, it's less known for its poetic tradition. Right. Is that right?
Yeah. It's more known for, I don't know the translation of like sort of like a lyric or a song.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a pretty difficult thing to translate because, the difference between shi, so shi is normally translated as poetry, but si is also just as much a kind of poetry.
Yeah. Back then, shi was a kind of poetry. It wasn't poetry altogether.
It was poetry altogether and a specific kind of poetry.
Yeah, okay. So the context of the question that we're reading is the mid to late 11th century in the Song Dynasty. Things are starting to change quickly. The emperor, who is Emperor Shenzong, is a reform-minded emperor. Specifically, he wants to reform a lot of things, but there's been a lot of pressure to have an expanded and more effective civil bureaucracy. He wants a more expanded military, and of course his counselors have all told him this is insane. And then into the fray steps a counselor named Wang Anshi.
Wang Anshi, he's a big name in Song Dynasty, Northern Song Dynasty politics. He is one of the big guys, along with Sudongpo, which, for those of y'all who are keeping track, there's a famous kind of pork dish named after him.
Which is what?
Dongpo roll.
Oh.
That's him. That's his favorite pork dish.
I didn't know that.
Those of y'all who are Zhongguo Tong might have eaten some of his...
Yeah. Some of his pork.
It's delicious.
It is delicious. It is quite delicious. So,
Sudongpo and Wang Anshi were horrible enemies. They were at each other's
hated
throat
each other
constantly.
Yeah.
And, this test, this exam is given in some of these reforms, and people, so this may seem like a very dry subject, but in fact, people were going at each other's throats. People were getting killed. People were getting executed. People were getting banished over these questions. And that's one of the context. That's some of the context for what we're looking at today.
And Wang Anshi, roughly the time of this question that we're reading now, there's a real push to get rid of poetry from the exams, to actually expand the exam system so that no one is chosen essentially outside of it for the officials. I mean, any government officials at this time, there were different ways you could enter the civil service. One of them was through recommendation, family member recommends you or whatever. And then you could be transferred in from the military, or there were the exams.
And I think that's one of the things that people don't get when they talk about the exams is they're not this continuous thing. It's not always one particular way. In the Tang Dynasty, it was more important to have a recommendation. It didn't matter as much how you did on the exam. But one of the things that's so revolutionary about what Wang Anshi is doing is that he is saying this exam system will be the end-all, be-all of a civil service exam. Yeah. So we're talking about a civil service exam in the 11th century. That's centuries, almost a millennium before the United States would be able to implement a similar system. So this is a really, I think, advanced thing. It's one of the things that makes the kind of Chinese empire so advanced. I mean, there's a lot of talk about how fantastic China was. A lot of that, I think, is overblown, but this is really like something that is very advanced and something that we can still learn a lot from.
And when you think, and why do we say it's so advanced and so powerful, is because, at least in theory, this is the only way around things like hereditary titles.
Yeah.
This is it. You have to be able to prove your capabilities somehow, and without having hundreds of thousands of apprenticeships, this is it.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that Wang Anshi posited, is that because he didn't want all of the power being focused in, say, one place, at least theoretically, everyone should have an equal shot. Now, whether Wang Anshi actually meant this, he was a fairly. Actually, we were talking with one of our professors about this. I was anyway, and the best analog to a character like Wang Anshi in American history is an old governor of Louisiana named Huey P. Long.
You think Huey Long?
In the sense that Huey Long was an ambitious, conniving sometimes, brutal political candidate. He would blackmail. He would have people arrested on trumped-up charges just to get him out of the way. But he also built the first paved roads into the countryside. He's the one that helped to begin Louisiana State University, and one of his reasons was so that anyone could go to college, because he grew up poor and he wanted poor people to be able to go to college. So it's this weird dual figure. On the one hand, he's a complete punk, and on the other hand, he's actually doing something interesting with this. And so Wang Anshi is a similar figure.
Okay.
He pushes all of his rivals out of power within about 10 years and essentially is running the country. The emperor essentially does what he says. But what do we do with the exam system? So let's maybe just read the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we'll talk about why we sort of.
So we're just going to read the question.
Yes.
This is something that let me draw a picture. So we have passed the county level and the state level exams with flying colors, and now we are seated on our little mat before the emperor in one of his halls in the palace. The emperor comes out and he gives us this question.
And to add something to that, we're all sitting, we're waiting for the emperor to come out, expecting the standard poetry-based question. And in fact, the helpers have already been passing out the rhyme dictionaries.
So the poetry rhyme dictionary. So I've got my poetry rhyme dictionary. I'm sitting here with my pen wet.
You're ready. You're going to kill it. You're ready for your poetry exam. And here's the question. And this is read by the emperor in the first person. My virtue is not like the ancient kings. I am supported by my people, and it is by means of this that I manage all those under heaven, and conduct a search for those in all lands who are virtuous. This invitation to the court is in order to consult with you about world affairs. How could the special test be for the purpose of testing you? It is rather to broaden what I know. Probably, when the sages ruled the world, the 100 officials were all well positioned, and the 10,000 things were all in order. There were things that were not done, and when things were done, they always succeeded. There were things that were not reformed, and when things were reformed, everything was brought under control. The fields were cultivated, waterways controlled, the grass and trees luxuriant, the birds, beasts, fish, and turtles all attained to their nature. Wealth was sufficient for the cultivation of the rights, knowledge sufficient for the expansion of music, governance sufficient for the bringing about of justice. By means of what can officials achieve this? So, you're essentially, you're waiting for your poetry question.
Where's my poetry, dang it?
Exactly. He goes on a little. I didn't read the rest of it, but that's the question.
Sure.
What I just read.
Sure.
And he references that the ancient sage kings of Yao and Shen and Zhou, sort of, this is it.
Those are the guys, yeah. God-like figures. They are really God figures.
So essentially, you go in expecting a poetry exam or something akin to that, and the emperor says, I want you to tell me
how to run the country.
How can we make China great again? To bring in one of our presidential candidates here. How are we going to be like the old kings? Proceed. And in the description in the collected works of the Song, right, in the introduction of this passage, there's apparently lots of freaking out in the room because no one had a clue what to do with this question. But why is it significant that this is the question and not a poetry question?
Well, I mean, I guess one reason is because it seems like, I mean, to us, I think poetry, when we say poetry, it almost seems this very conservative thing, like this dead white guy, symbol of the canon sort of thing.
Opining in fields of poppies,
exactly.
You know.
But for them, poetry was like TV or films. Like, it's the kind of form of entertainment, right?
Entertainment and, depending on the kind of poem, civilization as well.
Sure, absolutely.
And this is important for the listener who isn't as brilliant as you or me.
Wah.
Exactly. We need some kind of buzzer to mark when we're being sarcastic. But anyway, or who hasn't perhaps read a lot about ancient China, music and poetry were not just flippant things that you did. There's a passage, for example, by Mencius, Mengzi, where he's approached by one of the advisors of the king who's a little worried. He's like, the king is asked about music. He wants to listen to music. I don't know what to do. And Mencius goes to the king and essentially, in a gross paraphrase, says, this is great that you're concerned about music. Essentially, the king who is concerned about music is clearly fit to govern his people.
Yeah.
There's something in ancient Chinese thought about the way music works, about its structure, its harmony, that if you were able to appreciate it, tap into it, you were fit to, you understood the way things worked.
You got the universe.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's interesting about that, though, is that by this time, so it's, I don't know if it's exactly right to say liberal or more hedonistic, more populist to talk about poetry. And the sort of conservative move is to talk about the rights.
Ah, yes.
The classics.
Yes, yeah.
The classics, essentially.
Yeah.
Which Mencius, who you just mentioned.
That's true.
He is one of those guys who becomes the classic. So even though Mencius is saying you should be interested in poetry, you should be interested in music, the people who support Mencius are actually not following his rules. They're actually interested in Mencius rather than interested in doing what he says. So this move that Wang Anshi makes and the emperor, by having this kind of not poetry-oriented, but
policy,
classics, but policy based in the classics.
Yeah.
This policy based in the classics oriented exam. That is actually a very kind of radical conservatism.
It is, and yet at the same time, it's fascinating because, you're right. I think that's a really good term, actually, because
radical conservatism.
Yeah, well, when you think about the way that education works, for example, in the United States, the sort of quote-unquote liberal arts education does not have a lot of popularity among, say, I'm speaking very broad, like,
please,
very stereotypically here, but most of the friends and contacts I have who are on the more conservative side think that, for example, having a mandatory class about English Romantic poetry is silly.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you go to get practical skills and get a job and carry your weight in the world. That's the way things are supposed to work. Was the idea that you should be well-versed in, like, philosophy and painting and music. That's for people who don't have enough gumption to go out and get a job.
There's actually a brand of conservatism that disagrees with that. I'm thinking of Lynn Cheney.
Yeah.
She actually, is very much supportive of that kind of thing.
Sure. And that's why I'm saying, speaking very stereotypically.
Sure.
But that's why your phrase radical conservatism is probably a better one, because the farther right you get, the less tolerance there is, the less interest there is in, say, being a well-rounded scholar, like in the classical mode. Mm-hmm. But here, there's a desire to say, we want people to know the classics, not by rote, but actually be able to use them to take us to a place where we need to be. It needs to be practical use of the classics. And
I guess poetry is seen as not practical.
Yeah. I mean,
I
guess
it's for fun.
Or, I'm not sure, how would we classify that?
I would say it's partially for fun, I'll use that word, partially for aesthetics, and partially for kind of advancement through aesthetics. If I
Maybe.
can, like during the Tang Dynasty, people got positions based on how well they wrote poetry.
And I guess the best comparison we could make would be to the late 18th century when Friedrich Schiller is writing about aesthetics. Uh-huh. And the whole Western...
Oh, please don't Schiller me.
I know, I'm sorry. We've all had to read Schiller like 5 times in the university here. But anyway,
I haven't.
Really?
Never, no.
You were just making a pun?
Yes.
It was brilliant. I didn't catch it. It was so brilliant, I didn't even catch it. It flew right by me. No, but the sort of quote-unquote liberal arts education or liberal education we have derives from Schiller, who basically says, Kant had some great ideas, and I thought that the French Revolution was going to be amazing, but it's degenerated into political chaos. Something's missing. What's missing? Well, the people need an aesthetic education. If you're going to have a populace that's moral and ethical and wants the good for everybody, then you have to teach them things like painting and music.
Help me out. Wang Anshi has traveled back in time and rejected Schiller 5 centuries before Schiller existed.
Yes, that's more or less where it's at. No, but I like that. I like that what you just said, though, because
Chinese science fiction novels.
I would read that. I mean, I would buy that.
Oh, goodness.
No, but it's funny because this seems to be the kind of issue that comes up again and again and again and again. This, should you study poetry and art and things like this because it makes you sort of well-rounded and sensitive to the way the universe works? Mm-hmm. Or should everything you learn
be practical?
Huh. And this is the move that Wang Anshi is making.
But I want to push back against that. So there is something to me as a 21st century American that seems strange to go, we should reject this poetry from 5 centuries ago because it's not practical. Let's get back to those even deader, whiter guys. Those guys knew what they were doing. They were practical. Like, let's go back to that.
But you know what? The Shakespeare's one thing, but we need to go farther. We need to go back to Homer. What is Shakespeare now?
Yeah.
Right. No, that's interesting. That's a good way to put it, because that is essentially what they're arguing.
But that seems natural. Like, no one seems to question that argument, or there's very little resistance to that argument.
Yeah.
And so even though that sounds ridiculous to us as the two of us as 21st century Americans, and I assume everyone who's listening to this podcast, the listener is
millions of them.
Is a 21st century person.
Yes.
There are probably some 22nd century people like excavating this.
Yes.
But
I hope not.
But there is something very interesting and very strange sounding in that. Let's not do Shakespeare. Let's do Roman stuff. Those guys, those were practical.
Let's do Cicero.
What is Shakespeare?
Yeah. Well, and again though, this is one of the things that's so utterly fascinating about studying ancient China, because until the 18th century, there did not exist in China what we would think of as a progressive historical worldview. The idea that we are progressing, we are improving, and sort of the best stuff is in the future. Mm-hmm. We're progressing to a point where things are going to be better. In ancient China, the best stuff has already happened.
So I think that's definitely true. Why do you suggest it's 18th century that it emerges? Is that Qing Dynasty? Is there a Qing Dynasty progressive historian? I would say that comes with the arrival of the West and that view of history.
That could be.
So, and let me just remind the listener and you too, before the Renaissance, the West did not have that sort of progressive historical understanding. Definitely during the medieval period, everybody said everything was better back in Roman times. Mm-hmm. Those were the good times. Now, I think there's a lot of good reasons for them to believe that, because if you think about the material conditions of medieval Europe,
some of them anyway. I mean,
I can't think of a place where I would be like, I'd rather live in that that time in medieval Europe rather than in classical Rome.
Of course, to be fair, I haven't read that much about medieval Europe. Most of us haven't. So, no, I've
been there. I don't know if you've heard about the Renaissance Fair, the highly misnamed Renaissance Fair.
Right. I forgot about that.
Yeah, no. It's a time traveling company.
I'll yield to your expertise.
Okay,
that's
please.
Fair enough. That's fair.
But there's definitely a reason. Like material conditions, really, to put it bluntly, sucked in medieval Europe compared to a lot of classical conditions. And like you go to Rome, and it's amazing because you've just got these people living in squalid kind of encampments in Rome. You've got 1 million people lived in Rome at its height. And then by the year 800 CE, you've got 50,000 people there, just in encampments. Think about those people like looking up at the Colosseum, and walking past these ruins and going like, wow, those guys, they must have been pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Like that, I think that idea, that helps us understand what's going on in China at this period, the kind of love of classicism. Though I think it's much more understandable for me in medieval Europe than it is in medieval China.
Yeah. It's true, and I think it is quite a while until they develop something different in Chinese thought. But that's one of the things that makes an exam question like this so fascinating, because it isn't that they're just advocating going back to the good old days. It's that idea. We're going to look back in the past in order to develop forward as a nation.
Huh.
And it's being given on the fly to exam candidates.
These are, and we should say, these guys are, and I use this term hesitantly, the best and the brightest.
Yeah, for sure.
These guys have gone through a lot of study. They've gotten here. They are really intelligent guys, and they're very... And we should point out they're all men.
Oh yeah,
they have a very in-depth knowledge of the classics and poetry.
Yeah, and we should really point out how long it takes to go through this process. Yeah. This isn't like studying for the GRE or the SAT then the GRE. You could knock out the SAT in 6 months, a year. GRE, same thing. Most of these guys have been preparing literally decades to get to this final exam.
Start when you're 3, 4, 5 years old, something like that. People, the geniuses, they talk about how awesome they were when they were 5 with this stuff. And the regular people, they'll try and take this test again and again every 3 years until they're 30, 40, 50 years old. They keep going.
And in fact, there was on the books for a while in the early 11th century, I think, a regulation about the number of times you have to have failed the exam before you're allowed to pass this thing. They eventually, I think, got rid of it. But there was for a while this idea that you have to sort of have shown you can hang in there. So not only is it just an exam, it's an endurance race.
Wow.
And to get to the end of this endurance race and to have the emperor and his, behind the throne counselor say, all right, so you learned a bunch of poetry. Hooray for you. How are we going to change the country?
Using the classics. It's a insanely...
It really would be like going to sit in the GRE, you're cranked, ready to go, and someone hands you a newspaper and says, what are we going to do about this?
Yeah.
You're like, what? That's my exam? Yep, that's your exam. I want you to be able to reference Cicero and Homer and tell me how it's going to make this better.
I thought I was just going to get a math test.
I know. So it's a fascinating thing, and as a sort of a parting thought, when I was living in China, I used to think that the Gaokao, it's called the sort of college entrance exam, was complete insanity because high school students spend every waking hour for like 3 years preparing for this test.
Yeah.
I had in my freshman class when I was teaching in the university, 20-something students, 3 of whom did not have glasses. All of the others ended up needing glasses because their eyes burned out studying for this exam.
Taiwan's similar, though I don't think it's quite to the same degree. Japan has a similar tradition. Korea has a similar tradition. France, I think that if the listener is familiar with the French system, the baccalaureate,
it's huge.
Is very similar kind of system. It's like everything in your life depends on this one test.
And so it's fascinating to go back to something like this and realize that this isn't just something that the modern nation state dreamed up to qualify its citizens. This is an entrenched tradition that is literally millennia old.
Yeah. And I should point out, this has the Gaokao sort of has a perverse effect, I think, in that a lot of the Chinese attitude towards college is like, well, I put everything into that Gaokao, so now I'm just chilling out.
If you can pass the Gaokao, you get out of college.
Right.
Like, that's it, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. I don't think in America at least, you and I certainly didn't think of the SAT in that way. SAT was a way to get into college, but then when you get into college, you're slammed by a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
There is no stopping. And I think that maybe makes for a better academic environment in college. I don't want to extrapolate too far, but I mean, there is a definite reason why I think that American colleges are a lot stronger than definitely Chinese ones. So you're very familiar with the French system. Do you think the baccalaureate detracts from French colleges? Do they go into college saying to heck with it?
No, I don't get that thought at all. I could be wrong. I don't know that much about their system, but I don't get that feeling.
I'd qualify you as an expert on both the Chinese and the French sides.
That's terrifying for everyone involved.
And on that note, I think we can wrap that up. Do you have any concluding thoughts?
No, that was mine.
Great. Well, that's it for today. So we have an 11th century Gaokao, essentially. We are going to try and put it up on the website if you want to take a look at it. We'll have the Chinese original and the English translation.
We didn't read the Chinese because it's A, very long, and B, it's in classical.
Sorry. We read the classical Chinese, but we didn't read it out loud.
Oh, yes,
to you
yes.
Because we didn't want to bore you, the listener. It's impossible to understand, even if you speak fluent Chinese.
You have to have actually studied classical, and we read this with the help of an advisor and professor, so it wasn't like we just picked it up and
expert on Wang Anshi.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Well, that's it. I'm Lee Moore.
And I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.